Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 144, where we're going to talk about how real change in your marriage really happens. So if you've ever been frustrated by slow or no change in your relationship, either on your partner's end or your own end, or you just want to be able to change and evolve effectively starting from now on, this episode is for you. But before we dive in, I want to share a fun announcement, which is I'm about to start recording in the coming weeks a Q&A episode, or possibly more than one, meaning I want to hear from you. I want to hear what your questions are that you'd love to hear addressed on the podcast. So in order to submit your question, head over to www.lifeisworthloving.com/email. So you're going to need to hop on my email list in order to get the instructions on how to submit your question. You can also just go to the link in the show notes. The show notes are simply, if you're confused when I say that, they're just the description at this point of the podcast episode that you're currently listening to on whatever app you're listening to. So you'll find the show notes there. I'm doing it this way because I'm going to be sending out specific instructions for how to submit your Q&A question via email over the coming weeks, probably a couple times. So there'll probably be a couple different opportunities within the coming weeks to submit your question. So I want you to start thinking about it now. Hop on the email list, get ready to submit your question because I want to answer it here for you on the podcast. All right, let's dive into today's episode. If you're serious about creating lasting change in your marriage, so you aren't falling into those same old painful dynamics with your partner again and again, like so many of us do, and instead you want to see things actually get better over time, you got to understand how change works, not just what to do to create it. So I've given you a lot of things on this episode, on this podcast, this whole podcast about what to do to create change, like the specific things you need to do. But this episode is going to focus on that some more, on what to do to bring about changes you want between your spouse. But I also want to bring you some realistic and encouraging understandings on how the process of change really works and give you some clear suggestions to help it stick. Because really changing means building a healthy relationship with the process of change, which is really all about understanding how change works. So let's do that now. And I do want you to know that today's episode is as much for those of you who are currently my clients as for those of you who are just listeners right now of the podcast, because y'all need to learn how change really works. So let's start with my own sort of a non-relationship story of trying to change recently. So I realized quite a few years ago at this point that I'm a terrible typer. Like I make so many mistakes per minute and I have to go back and fix them, which takes so much time. It really just makes a whole lot extra labor for me when I'm writing. And I have a brain that wants to write really fast, but my fingers cannot do it. So I never actually had typing training like so many people do. My kids are actually much better typers than me. So I finally decided I would learn to type properly because it was taking up so much extra energy and time. So of course, learning to type right correctly means breaking old habits of typing and creating new habits, as most change does, right? It's about learning and unlearning. So anyway, I'm using an app to help me learn how to type. And it's been kind of fun, but it's also been extremely hard. My old habits of typing are so ingrained, and I've had moments, for sure, lots of moments of being frustrated, especially after I've been working at it for a while. right? Like I keep typing the wrong things. But luckily, I can call on my understanding of how the brain really changes and how to support it to change effectively. So I don't fall prey to discouragement and giving up. And I'm able to keep growing as a typist because of it. So in other words, understanding the process of change and how it works in the brain, my brain, has really helped me with patience with myself and perseverance. And that is a big part of what it takes to improve and grow and change. Yeah? So I absolutely get it if you've ever been frustrated with yourself or with your partner when it comes to evolving and making changes that actually stick. So let's talk about that in your relationship right now. One of the ways you can think about making huge, positive, lasting change in your marriage, and this is great news, is by making lots of little, small changes here and there in how you relate to your partner and in how you think and feel about things with your partner. And of course, also how you relate to yourself. All of this is so important for making change in your marriage. And small changes really add up. And I even made a whole podcast episode about this. It's episode 19. It's called Little Shifts Equal Big Change in Your Love Life. That's a fun one to listen to. So little changes add up. And depending on your unique relationship and the issues in it, the things that are making it hard, these small changes can look like, just as some examples for you, no longer scolding your partner for, say, being late or eating too much, for example, or starting to see things about him that you've had in the past a tendency to judge or be annoyed by, in starting to see those things in a more accepting way. Or maybe for you, it means consciously admiring your partner more instead of just waiting for him to do something you can easily admire. Or maybe instead of complaining like you might normally do, that was definitely a habit of mine, instead of vulnerably sharing what it is that you really want and why it matters to you. So those are some changes some of you might be working on making. But no matter the issue that makes things with your partner less than totally happy, it's definitely for each and every one of you going to mean taking on quite a few new, more helpful perspectives and leaving unhelpful ones behind and learning how to be with your own self in new and powerful ways and taking new actions that do not feel natural at first. Guaranteed, any change you're going for in your marriage is going to require that. And my main point being here is that there are many, many little things you can shift in the way that you think about and relate to your husband and yourself that will add up to big change in your marriage. And that's wonderful news. But the thing is that even though making lots of little changes sounds easier than making lots of big changes all at once, and it is, even little changes of habit can be difficult for the human brain. But that is what we have. That, the human brain, is the equipment we have to work with. So we need to learn how to work with it, this wonderful and sometimes difficult human brain of ours. And the thing about the human brain is that it likes its old patterns, its old habits. It actually wants to keep running your same old programming, the old way of doing things, your old way of seeing things, because it's the most efficient thing for it to do. And the brain is driven by efficiency. Like when it comes to trying to learn how to type better, my pointer finger really wants to keep pecking the P and the I and the L on the keyboard, my pointer finger, even though I've spent time practicing using the proper fingers, right? It's a habit, and it's most efficient for my brain to keep doing that. At least that's kind of how the brain thinks, right? It's actually not. It would be much more efficient if I use the correct ones, but my brain doesn't want to expend the energy to stop doing it that way. So you can't take old programming out of the brain just like that. I snapped my fingers. You hear that? You don't just see a new perspective and then always see it that new, more helpful way from then on. Now, it can happen this way for sure. It can be like a light bulb goes off and stays that way forever, right? Like that bright, new, fabulous way forever that really serves you in your relationship. That can totally happen. For example, one of my clients, who I'm going to call Sally, on our first call, she suddenly became aware of how a certain way of speaking to her husband kind of elicited from him an argumentative way of reacting, and often a kind of petty argument would happen from there. So that moment of realization, and then the one concept about self-ownership that we talked about together on that first call, changed everything in her marriage, or a lot in her marriage, instantly. And ever after that, she was great at speaking, at least most of the time. She was great at speaking very differently to him, which made way for all sorts of new ways of relating to each other and new dreams for their lives to happen. So these light bulb change everything in an instant moments do happen. They definitely do. But usually what happens is it's like a light bulb goes off. For example, you see things in a new way that feels so much better, that works so much better, or you try a new approach to, say, communicating, and it goes so much better than your old way. But then, as you go about life, it's like the light dims a little, or the light bulb goes off again, and you're back to reacting like you used to, and acting out like those old painful patterns again. Does that sound familiar to any of you? I have been there, for sure. Like, I remember early in my husband's and my relationship, I remember sitting on the porch in a rocking chair after fuming for a while about something he said. And I don't remember the exact specifics of what it was. I just remember having the experience of having such a deep insight about how I was blaming him for doing something to make me mad, when in actuality, it was my own way of seeing things and of interpreting what he did that was creating those feelings of anger. I was really stuck. I had been really stuck in judgment and fear mode. Hello, lizard brain, right? Instead of considering his perspective and reasons for acting how he did. And, when looking at it, they were his reasons, his perspective, his actions were actually legitimate. So I just remember the feeling that light bulb moment where I felt so clear and so free of anger and blame. It felt like I could never fall back into blaming him or being angry at him about that same kind of thing. Like, I'd always stay so able to see his point of view, etc., right? And I giggle because it didn't stick, right? That very same issue came up again only days later in a slightly different flavor, and I acted the same old way. And so none of this is a surprise to me now, because I truly get how change happens. And it most often isn't about just one instant of great clarity. So although these moments of seeing differently, of having different experiences are very powerful and very important, they are a part of change, absolutely. There are also other levels of change, other things that need to happen to make that change concrete and lasting, right? Like to make it stick. And I know that it always reassures my clients when I tell them that there are actually 4 stages of change that I have discovered or that I see, and when I describe what they are. And so I want to do that for you today as well. And if you've heard that phrase of the 4 stages of change, these ones are different. They might be somewhat overlapping to those classic ones, but also different. So stay tuned, perk your ears. So I want to start, though, with what I think of as the pre-change stage. And this is actually where many of you are and where most of you get stuck. or I should just say most people get stuck here. And this is the part where you have some intellectual understanding of what you might need to do to change. So perhaps you have some education, perhaps like those of you listening to the podcast, especially if you've been listening to many episodes so far, you've learned a fair amount, right? And you might have decided you want to do some of the suggestions that I've given you. For example, say sharing your feelings vulnerably and with ownership when you're communicating with your partner about how a certain interaction between you was hard for you or something, right? Or maybe for you, it's about appreciating your partner more for the things you want him to keep doing more of. I have a whole episode about that, and I call this reinforcing his goodness, right? So those are some things that you might have. There's many other things you might have decided as well that you want to try. And yet for many of you, when you go to actually try to live these things out, what you've learned here on the podcast, what you find is that things in your interactions aren't actually changing, or you might succeed at it once, but it doesn't really stick. Like you forget in the moment what you learned. You might, for example, complain about what he didn't do instead of remembering to tell him you appreciated that he did the dishes or he hugged you this morning, right? Or when you have a conversation, you huff and blame him for how you feel instead of remembering to share your feelings with vulnerability and ownership, right? In other words, you just don't utilize any of your learning or the tools. And then what might happen is in your brain, you're like, why aren't things changing? I've been listening to the podcast. I've been reading books. I get some of these ideas and concepts. So how come I can't do it differently? How come we keep having the same interactions over and over? How come nothing is really changing? And you might even from there question if change is even possible between you. I see so many people get stuck here. And I've been there too. I think this is really normal. We learn something and we think we should just be able to do it, but then we can't and we get frustrated and discouraged, etc. So if this has ever happened to you, I want you to know this. This is actually the normal but pre-stage of change. This is having some intellectual knowledge, but not really being able to apply it, not really being able to live that intellectual knowledge out in a regular way. And yes, it is incredibly frustrating and even discouraging, particularly if you think you should be able to learn something and suddenly just be able to do it. But that, my friend, is not how change works. And that's why I want to share with you how the 4 stages of change really work and what to expect and how to work with it so change really sticks. But before I do that, I want to give you a reminder. Some of you, this will be a reminder. For some of you, this will be totally new, which is the way that a metaphor or an analogy that I like to use for neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the term that we use when we're talking about how the brain changes, right? It's the neuroscience of how the brain really changes and how we grow and evolve and change as humans. So we can't change our habits, like I said earlier, without changing our brains, since that is where our habits and actions originate, in our brains. So I want you to think of it this way. When we want to stop some old habit or old way of, say, interacting with your partner, it's like wanting to stop driving down like the super big, well-maintained, fast superhighway that you go on every day, right? That you've been taking for years. It's the easiest, most efficient, most habituated route for you to go down. And when we're wanting to make that change, we're instead going to have to start by bushwhacking a new trail through the woods. Sounds a lot harder than getting on that fast highway, right? But here's what happens. As we start to go down that new bushwhacked trail more often, that path slowly turns into a dirt footpath, right? With no more branches in the way. And then it becomes a bigger, wider path. And then a dirt road. And then eventually, it's like it's a small paved road and then a highway. And then finally, it becomes a new superhighway that's the fastest, quickest route for you to take. That is, in a nutshell, how we really change. So now that you have that visual of what's happening in the brain for change to stick, let's go over the 4 stages of change and what they're actually like as you try to change things in your marriage. So the first stage, number 1, which is after you've had the insight of a new way of doing or saying things that you know you want to stick with, the first stage is actually catching yourself after you reacted in the same old way or did the same old thing in the same old way. So it's catching yourself after you did it that old way. So an example, and I'm going to use this example probably throughout the rest of the podcast episode here. And I just want you to know, as a side note, I'm using this as an example just to illustrate it. I'm not talking only about that particular change, though. You can apply this to any change you want to make in your relationship. But my example is, if you recently recognize that the way that you speak to your husband when you don't like something that he did, if you notice that that elicits a defensive reaction and shuts down effective communication between you, right? Like maybe like my client, Sally, like it gets you argumentative with each other. And you know that you don't want to speak to him in that tone of voice anymore or that way anymore, right? So that's the beginning phase. This is like the pre-stage, right? You realize it, you don't want to do it anymore. You even have some insight into how to do it differently. But of course, as you go about your daily life, you just forget to be conscious, right? You just forget and you find yourself reacting in the same old way. Once again, saying something in that tone of voice that gets you nowhere with him. So in this first stage, what you're going to do is you're going to notice after the fact. You're going to look back after you had that snippy interaction with him, and you're going to look at what was going on there that led to that for you, retroactively. And a great way to do this is actually every night to be like, at the end of the day, to sit down for just a few minutes and be like, okay, what happened today between me and my husband that I didn't like? And like, did I fall back into any old habits, right? And just notice. And then you'll be able to look back and see exactly what you were thinking and feeling that led to that way of speaking. Because that's where it comes from, our thoughts and our feelings. If you're a regular listener of this podcast, you'll know that the words you say, the tone you use comes from what you're thinking and feeling. So you're going to recognize that. You're going to notice what thoughts and feelings you were having. And then you're going to be able to imagine yourself into the way you wish you had done it. You're going to, in the present, get yourself into the feeling state that you want to be in, say a peaceful feeling state instead of an agitated one, by guiding your emotions and your thoughts and your nervous system into that state, right? That more conducive state to speaking the words in the tone that's most effective. So in other words, you're just going to imagine it happening. And actually, there's some amazing studies. I might have talked about this on the podcast. I think it's fascinating. There's one study in particular about, they did an experiment between people actually playing a new piece of music on the actual piano and learning it by playing it, and then other people who just imagined themselves playing on a piano, and the results were almost the same. The people who imagined themselves playing the piano instead of actually playing it were almost as good as the people who were actually playing it. So our imagination is super powerful. It's a way of like rehearsing and imagining, like actually having the experience without actually having the experience. Okay. So of course, when I work with clients, I have very specific tools to be able to do all of this that I teach my clients. Tools about looking at their thoughts and feelings and actions, and imagining themselves or shifting and changing them into new ones that are much more effective. So, and that's like, I teach them those. And it's one of the reasons they actually do get real lasting change, because there are very specific tools that super help with this. And they're sort of beyond the scope of this podcast. But in any case, when you do this, it's, like I said before, it's almost as good as actually having done it in real life, like when you're just imagining it. And it actually helps establish the neurocircuitry to be able to do it better in the future in real life. So even though you do this after the fact of the event, right after the fact of falling back into that old pattern. Like you took that old superhighway back to that old place that doesn't work so well for you, right? This act of imagining yourself doing it differently is actually like re-walking over that freshly bushwhacked new trail that you're wanting to create, that you started to create in the pre-stage. And you're helping it to make it more of a well-worn road that will be easier to find in the future and travel down again next time. So I do want to say that this first stage can kind of be the longest because the superhighway of the old way is just so easy and fast to travel down. So I really invite you to have a lot of patience here. And this is truthfully kind of the unsexy part, right? It's the practice part. It's the efforting part. Just like paving a new road is work, right? It looks hot and exhausting, but it makes for an amazing, smooth, fast, easy ride later. And that's why it's so worth it. And of course, it's a lot easier with help. But it really is so worth it because you're going to start from there entering into stage 2. So stage 2 is catching yourself in the middle of the old pattern and changing it right then and there. So you don't fully play it out, right? So if we're going to use the same example of changing how you speak to your spouse, perhaps what happens is you realize you're activated as soon as you start hearing your own tone of voice. Or maybe when you see the first sign of your partner getting defensive. Yeah? And then you change course right then. You use the tools you've learned to shift your emotions, to shift your nervous system, your thinking, and you speak in a calmer voice. Or maybe you even say, oh, sorry for how that came out. Whoops. What I meant is, or let me try that again. Can I have a redo? Yeah? So when you get here to being able to see and stop the old way while it's happening, this is a sign that the new pattern is becoming easier for you to access. Now, you still might not use the correct tone, for example, right off the bat, but you're able to start doing it in the middle of the conversation or soon when you hear it happening, right? So to go back to our road metaphor again, think of this as by accident and totally unconsciously taking that old superhighway once again, because it's still a habit, of course, but then realizing you got on the wrong road pretty quickly and getting off at the next exit and going onto your new emerging dirt road instead. And that dirt road's going to get you where you want to go instead of where you don't. And so the more you do this, the wider and smoother that new road gets until you find yourself at stage 3. So stage 3 is when you get yourself into the proper state of mind and heart to do whatever the changes you're working on and to do it right off the bat. For example, you get in the proper state of mind and heart and emotion in order to communicate effectively and lovingly before you actually utter a word, right? Like perhaps he does something you don't like once again, and you just notice it. Maybe you even have the same feeling momentarily that used to lead to you speaking in that snippy way, that tone that elicited his defensiveness, right? Maybe you feel aggravated or annoyed, for example, but you don't use that aggravated tone. Instead, you're able to catch it beforehand and consciously, purposefully shift into a more peaceful space and then speak from there. And so your partner does not react defensively. Hurrah! And in this stage, you still most likely have to choose this consciously on purpose. And it might take just a bit of effort, but you succeed in doing it fully before you speak. And so in terms of our neuroplasticity road metaphor, again, you can think of this as getting to the place where there's a fork in the road, right? You can choose consciously between getting on the old superhighway and getting onto that newly paved road before you even start on either path, right? And of course, then you intentionally choose to take the new road. Which brings me now to the 4th stage. So this is the classic stage some of you may have heard of, which is called unconscious competence, when you don't even need to think about it, right? So in our example, when he does something you don't like so much, you're just natural at communicating in a way that really works to get through to your partner without negative reaction from him. Like you don't even go into the aggravation that you used to feel, and there's no extra effort involved. It just happens as if on its own, and you really just do it all the time now. So this is in our road metaphor when you don't really even notice that there is an old superhighway because you've made the new one, the new road, big and wide enough that it's the new superhighway, right? That you just naturally go that way because it's the most fastest, efficient way to go. And in fact, the old highway starts to crumble and get overgrown with weeds, and eventually it becomes impassable. So you just don't take it ever anymore. So what I think is fascinating is that when we go into improving our marriages, or even if we want our partner to be improving the marriage, almost all of us unconsciously expect that we should just be able to jump from where we are right now, most likely in the pre-change stage, to stage 4. To just being correct at interacting in the most loving ways that are most conducive to joy and intimacy and lightheartedness that we crave in our relationship. Like we think we should just because we learned that there are these ways to do it, or because we talked to our partner about these are the ways that he could do it, we think we and he should just be able to do it, right? But that's not how change works, my friends. So I invite you to understand these 4 phases of change so that you can stop being hard on yourself and hard on your partner when it's hard to change. Because our old patterns are literally wired into us like superhighways. And we need to go through this process of creating those new roads that take a while, take effort, and also specific skills to be able to grow into new superhighways that just make it natural to do things in the way that are best and most conducive to the loving connection that we all want together. And yes, even your partner wants that too, even if he's not so skillful in doing those new ways. It actually takes a substantial amount of self-awareness and dedication and persistence to make these changes. And this doesn't mean it's super hard though. So I don't want you to be taking this as, oh God, it's so hard, it's almost impossible. It can actually be really simple when you have the right tools and skills and guidance and support. And this is exactly why I've created my marriage coaching program for highly sensitive women, which is called Treasured, by the way, in the way that I have, because it offers all of the things that you need to actually create real lasting change. The best of the tools, the teachings, the skill development, the guidance and coaching and community support to make the most effective, loving, beneficial ways of interacting with your partner simply natural habits, right? To make ways that will bring out the best of yourself as a sensitive person and will also bring out the best in your significant other as well. So it becomes both of you improving your relationship together, right? Alongside each other. My program makes that simple, clear, and you feel totally supported in doing it. Because each of these stages, especially the first few stages, are just really so much harder to do on your own. Like even if you had the skills, which you likely don't fully have because I simply can't go as deep on the podcast as I can in my program, it's still so much harder to do on your own, if not impossible. Right? Even if you had those skills, which you probably don't. So I know I couldn't do it on my own. And Sally, the client I've been talking about on this episode that I mentioned before, she also told me before she started that she'd been trying to make these changes, the changes that she wanted with her husband on her own, with the help of my podcast for years and actually the help of other therapists. She'd been trying to do that for years and it wasn't working. But then, remember, that first week in my program, presto, instant change. And then more change every single week until she truly had a very new and harmonious feeling marriage after 20 years of it being hard. So having someone like me there, as well as a group of others doing the same work, helps you feel like you're not alone in this sometimes challenging process of change. And it shows you that it does work. because you're watching others succeed at it and you're being encouraged and supported with them. And it gives you new insights for yourself as to how you can apply the learning and the skills. And it helps you see what you're blind to on your own. And we all need that to navigate and succeed at real lasting change. And this is why we see people who are amazing at things have teachers and coaches, like sports coaches, for example, right? Like all amazing ball players, they had a coach helping them see what they couldn't see about how they were doing things and helping them learn new skills and like ways of working with the ball or whatever, and helping them stick to it when it felt hard. Like when their brains were not creating those new habits as fast as they wanted, right? And that's the same with doctors and surgeons and anyone who's really great at what they do. Anyone excellent at what they do had help learning how to get there and mastering the new habits and skills. And relationships are not any different. So if you're serious about wanting and sustaining real change in your marriage, like feeling that love and lightheartedness and connection grow deeper and way more frequent between you and your spouse, take advantage of me and my program, Treasured. You can learn all about it and join at the link in the description of this podcast, right? The show notes. Or you can head over to www.lifeisworthloving.com/treasured. And when you sign up to join, we get started right away. No more waiting, no more hoping. We're just going to get right down to it and start making that change, that love, that connection that you really want come to life. And I would never want to say you can't do this work on your own and make the changes you want. Maybe you are kind of like superhero independent person. But I've seen a lot of people try to do it on their own by listening to the podcast or reading books or whatever, and not seeing the change they want. And so therefore sort of staying in their unhappy, less than happy marriage for a whole lot longer than they need to if they had just decided to come to me earlier on, because that's when they do start to really see huge, amazing, wonderful, permanent change. So that's one of the reasons I do what I do. And in the way that I offer it in Treasured, because it works. All right, to sum all of this up, you can't get from stage 1 of change to stage 4, where you made all the changes you want between the two of you and everything's great and wonderful between you and your spouse, right? By skipping over the process of change. You can't skip the processes of change, the stages of change. You have to go through them. And as you do, especially with my help, you'll notice things getting better every day until you feel twice as good with your partner, and then twice that again, until you're simply so happy in your marriage. So have patience, have persistence, and get the help that makes this all happen the fastest and most deeply it can. And I am here for you. So join me in Treasured and be oh so well, my friend.